Hello, I'm Dan Gibson, and this is another video in the series Archaeology in Islam. Today's topic is Khadijah. In the last few months, a lot of things have been said about Khadijah on the internet. She is a controversial figure because of her role as the first wife of the Prophet Muhammad, and today some people are analyzing her life according to modern standards and expectations. And some want to elevate Khadijah to a very honorable level, even like sainthood. I've seen others, someone posting a video suggesting she was a Christian. And there's even suggestions that an old building in Mecca in Saudi Arabia was Khadijah's house. So, in the next few minutes, we're going to examine what the early source materials tell us about Khadijah. First, the traditionally accepted account. Khadijah bin Khuwaylid was born around 55 CE and died in 619 CE. Her father, Khuwaylid bin Asad, he was among the leading men of the Quraysh tribe who lived in and around the holy city of Islam. Based on the archaeological evidence that all of the extant mosques of the first century of Islam faced Petra in southern Jordan, from that I understand that Khadijah was born and raised in the Petra area. So I'll refer to Petra throughout this video, even though many of the source materials use the name Mecca, which I also believe referred to the city of Petra at this time. That's a topic that's in another video. We won't address it in this video. Khadijah's mother, Fatima bin Zaidah, died in 575 CE when Khadijah was 20 years old. Her mother was a member of the Amr bin Luay tribe of the Quraysh, and thus she was a third cousin to Muhammad's mother. According to some traditions, Khadijah's father died in 585 in the sacrilegious wars when Khadijah was 30 years old, and she took over her father's business. Now, not all of the Hadith writers agree on this, and others argue that he was still alive when Khadijah married Muhammad in 595, when she was 40 years old. Her father, Khuwaylid, also had a sister named Habib bint Asad. We're not told anything about her younger years except that at the age of 30, Khadijah found herself in a position of managing her father's business, using camels for long-distance merchant trade. In other words, she was a businesswoman. We have no idea how large or how small her business was when she inherited it, but in time Khadijah's caravan equaled the caravans of all the other traders of the Quraysh put together. Now, in the Petra scrolls, we find that it was popular to award people with honorific names around Petra. So it comes as no surprise that in the Islamic record, she's known as Amrat Quraysh, or the Princess of Quraysh. People also called her the Pious One, and also Khadijah al-Kubra, the Great One, Khadijah the Great. It is said that even though she was wealthy, she fed and clothed the poor and assisted her relatives financially and provided marriage portions for poor relations. It seems that Khadijah did not travel with her camels, but managed their routes and their loads from just outside of Petra, which was the hub for merchant caravans. I personally doubt that camel caravans were managed from the core of the city, but rather they would come and go from places outside of the city proper. Just as today, industrial areas are usually on the outskirts of the city and not downtown. Khadijah herself did not travel with the caravans, but she employed others to trade on her behalf for commission. When she was 40 years old, that is in 595 CE, Khadijah needed someone to manage a transaction in Syria. She chose Muhammad ibn Abdullah for the trade in Syria. With the permission of his uncle Abu Talib ibn Muttalib, Muhammad was sent to Syria with one of Khadijah's servants, whose name was Maysara. The caravan experience earned Muhammad the honorific title of Al-Sadiq, the truthful, Al-Amin, the trustworthy or the honest. Khadijah then hired Muhammad, who was then 25 years old, paying him double her usual commission. When the caravan returned, the servant, Maysara, gave accounts of the honorable way that Muhammad had conducted his business, and the result was that he brought about twice as much profit that Khadijah had expected. I'm sure this must have delighted Khadijah, for she saw in Muhammad a solution to one of her problems. As a wealthy, single, older woman, she was 40 years old, which in Arabia is old for a woman. I am sure that she was pestered by all the older men of the city, exploring to see if they could marry her, for her money, of course, but everyone wanted to marry her. Muhammad offered a solution to her. He was honest and trustworthy, so she proposed to him. Now, there are two accounts of her marriage, the Sunni account and the Shia account, and they're very different. First, the Shia account. Ibn Shah Rashib, who quotes various sources there on the screen, tells us that Khadijah was a virgin when she married Muhammad. She would have been from a high class because she was known as Khadijah al-Kubra, which was highly honorable among the people, and it was improbable that she would marry men from the Benu Tamim and the Benu Rakhzum, the two lower tribes that were there. The Shia say that the two children attributed to Khadijah were actually children of Hala, Khadijah's sister. After Hala's husband died, Khadijah took care of Hala, and after Hala's death, Hala's children were part of her household. Most Shia records say that Khadijah was 40 years old when she married Muhammad. However, some sources also claim that she was between 25 and 28 years old, and one source claims that she was 30. That was the Shia account. The Sunnis tell a different story. They claim that Khadijah was married twice before she married Muhammad, and that she had children from all of her marriages. While the order of her marriages are debated, it is generally believed that she first married a man named Atiq, and later she married a man named Malik ibn Nabash ibn Zarghari ibn al-Tamri. To her second husband, she bore two sons who were named Hala and Hind. The husband died before his business became a success, and to her husband Atiq, Khadijah bore a daughter named Hinda. The marriage also left Khadijah as a widow. So Khadijah proposed to Muhammad when he was 25 years old and she was 40 years old. Khadijah consulted her brother Waraq ibn Nawfal, ibn Sa'ad ibn Abdul al-Uzza. Khadijah entrusted a friend named Nafisa to approach Muhammad and ask if he would consider marrying. When Muhammad hesitated because he had no money to support a wife, Nafisa asked if he would consider marriage to a woman who had the means to provide for himself and no need for him to support her. Muhammad agreed to meet with Khadijah, and after this meeting they consulted with their respective uncles. The uncles agreed to the marriage, and his uncle Hazm ibn Abdullah and his uncle Abu Talib accompanied Muhammad when asking for the bride. Now, there's some argument over which of these uncles went with Muhammad, or did both of them go. I don't know if that'll ever be settled, but on several occasions I've gone with a young man to ask for a girl's hand in marriage. My personal experience is that the young man gathered all the support that he could get. So all of his uncles and his relatives that were in any sort of respectful position, and even someone like myself, a local scholar, gets invited. The more support he can demonstrate, the better his position will be. I remember one home we went in at one time, and we knocked on the door of the family. It was a family that had 3 young eligible girls, and we were a group of about 12 to 15 men. The youngest daughter opened the door, and her eyes got really big when she saw a young man with all the respected gentlemen behind him asking to see her father. We were ushered into the sitting room, and so we all crammed in and sat down and waited. Well, there was a lot of rustling around in the back room making tea or whatever, and they served us tea. I found it fascinating that each of the eligible young ladies of the house managed to find some serving item and bring it into the room so they could glance at the young man. From the amount of whispering and giggling, I'm sure that they didn't know which sister he was going to be asking for. They were just behind the door, and we could hear a little bit of them while we were sitting in the other room. Well, we had a nice visit with the father, and we discussed everything from the weather to politics, and we never broached the topic of marriage. Then we all stood up, and we all said our goodbyes, and we headed for the door. At the door, the boy's oldest uncle said his goodbyes, and then he turned and said, "Oh, by the way, we came to ask for the hand of your daughter in marriage." So we were all invited to come back in, and this time we sat down and we had more tea, and we sat and we haggled over how well prepared the young man was to support his bride. Later I learned the first part of the visit established that there was good blood between the two families. Nothing was brought up that would cause any disagreement between the families. If an argument would have started, then no marriage request would have been made. Now, over the years, I've not only had opportunity to attend several of these visits, but also to have a hand in actual negotiations representing a young woman who had no father or uncles who could represent her. And so I can only imagine that Muhammad would have taken both of his uncles along with him, because the more support he had, the better. For he was not asking Khadijah, he was asking her uncle, who would have the role of protecting her honor and that of the tribe. And so they would have negotiated and worked out the deal between the two families. According to Sunni traditions, Muhammad was 25 years old and Khadijah was 40 years old, and they had a successful marriage for 25 years until the death of Khadijah. It was only after her death that Muhammad took other wives and multiple wives. There is one report that states that Hisham bin Muhammad ibn al-Sa'ab reports from his father Muhammad ibn Sa'ab al-Khalbi from Abu Salah that Ibn Abbas said, "All the time of the marriage with the messenger of Muhammad, Khadijah was 28 years old." That's at the time of the marriage. But this disagrees with the bulk of the Sunni writers who say she was 40 years old. Muhammad and Khadijah may have had up to 8 children together. Al-Tabri names 8. Ibn Ishaq names 7 children, but most sources only identify 6. Their first son was Qasim, who died after his 3rd birthday. And following that, there were 4 daughters, and finally another son, Abdullah, who also died in childhood. 2 other children also lived in Khadijah's household: Ali bin Abi Talib, the son of Muhammad's uncle, and Zayd ibn Haritha, a boy from the Udra tribe who had been kidnapped and sold into slavery. Zayd was a slave in Khadijah's household for several years until his father came to Mecca to take him home. Muhammad insisted that Zayd be given a choice about where he wanted to live, and Zayd decided to remain where he was, after which Muhammad legally adopted Zayd as his own son. Now, all of this is an introduction to Khadijah and the role she played in Muhammad's life. After their marriage, Khadijah continued with her role of managing all of the operations of the caravans. But Muhammad, not having a place in the business, was very much free to do as he pleased. So he becomes a person of note in the city, especially when he comes in during the reconstruction of the Kaaba building. He is chosen by chance to be the one responsible to place the black rock into its place at the corner of the building. This was after reconstruction. Sometime after this, he was spending time in a secluded holy spot near the city. It was a place where pagans would go to meditate and contemplate. In that place, Muhammad had an experience that shocked him. A form of some sort appeared to him and commanded him to read or recite. It was a very difficult experience for him. And right afterwards, he felt that he'd either become crazy or he'd seen a spirit of some kind, so he decided to go out and kill himself. And so he decided to climb the nearby mountain and throw himself off the cliff and die. As he was climbing up, the apparition appeared to him again, blocking his way. After several attempts to climb the mountain so he could throw himself off, people came by and they took him home to Khadijah. Muhammad was very disturbed and unsure what was going on. Khadijah then consulted her Christian cousin, Waraka ibn Nawfal, who confirmed that Muhammad may have seen something holy. It's right about this time that the Eastern churches are starting to adopt Marian theology, and a church in Petra becomes the Church of Mary. So perhaps Waraka is very aware of special appearances and wonders if this isn't one of them. But Muhammad is still not convinced. So Khadijah consults others and comes back with a pagan test to see if it was an angel that Muhammad saw or something evil. Al-Tabari tells the story, volume 6, beginning on page 72. Khadijah says to Muhammad, "Can you tell me when this companion of yours who visits you comes?" He said, "Yes." And so she said, "Tell me again then when he comes." Now Gabriel came to him as before, and the messenger of God said to Khadijah, "Khadijah, here is Gabriel who has come to me." She said, "Yes, come and sit by my left thigh, cousin." He came and sat by her, and she said, "Can you see him?" He replied, "Yes." She said, "Move around and sit on my right thigh." So he did so, and she said, "Can you still see him?" He replied, "Yes." And she said, "Move around and sit in my lap." So he did so, and she said, "Can you see him?" He replied, "Yes." Then she was grieved and flung off her a covering while the messenger of God was sitting in her lap. Then she said, "Can you see him now?" And he replied, "No." At this she said, "Cousin, be steadfast and rejoice. By God, this being is an angel and no devil." From this story, we learn a little of how Khadijah thinks, and how she calls upon pagan rites to help her, not Christian rites. And once she bears herself and exposes herself, the angel is gone, and she assumes then that it was an angel and not a satanic being. Now, there are other things that tell us that Khadijah was a pagan and not a Christian. Ahmed ibn Hanbal tells us that Khadijah, the wife of the Prophet, had an idol to Al-Uzza in her house in pre-Islamic times. In the book of Idols, Hisham ibn al-Kalbi speaks of the Prophet Muhammad worshipping Al-Uzza. We have been told that the apostle of God once mentioned Al-Uzza, saying, "I have offered a white sheep to Al-Uzza while I was a follower of the religion of my people." Ibn Kathir repeats this in his tafsir on the Quran. Ibn Hanbal adds to the story that Muhammad and his wife used to worship this idol, Al-Uzza, just before bedtime each night. Additionally, whenever Muhammad complained that there was some evil eye affecting him, Khadijah used to send for an old elderly woman, a sorceress, to charm the evil eye away. There is absolutely no evidence that Khadijah was ever a Christian. Those who say this come to this conclusion because she went to her cousin, a Christian, Waraka ibn Nawfal, who was a believer. It was a Christian. He was one who copied the scriptures out for people who wanted a copy of the scriptures. He would do this from memory. But this going to Waraka was just normal, as it records in their holy book things about angels and visiting people, and so she went to her Christian cousin as well. But she also went to a pagan advisor as well. So it doesn't tell me that Khadijah was a Christian. I believe she was a pagan in her early life, and so was the Prophet Muhammad. Now, this may offend some people who hold that Muhammad was holy right from his birth, but I don't think that idea is in any of the early Islamic records. That's more or less comes from the Christian doctrine of Christ, and I think it's been put over into the Muslim doctrine about Muhammad. Listen to what the early writers tell us. This takes place in Jahiliyyah. Muhammad has not yet had his vision. He's still a pagan, and he meets with people who pursue the religion of Abraham and worship only Allah and not idols. Allah's a prophet, that's Muhammad, said that he met with Zayd bin Amr Nufal at a place near Belda. This had happened before Allah's apostle received divine inspiration. Allah's apostle presented him a dish of meat. Zayd bin Amr refused to eat of it, and then said, "I do not eat of what you slaughtered on your stone altars." Ansab is the word that's used here, or nasab. So I do not eat except on the name on which... So I do not eat except on which Allah's name has been mentioned on slaughtering. So here's the story of Muhammad before receiving his message, having a plate of food that was offered to idols. Al-Karkishi records in this way. Here's the story that he writes. The Prophet slaughtered a lamb for one of the idols. It was then roasted and then he carried it with him. Then Zayd bin Amr ibn Nufal met us in the upper part of the valley in one of the hot days of Mecca. When he met, we greeted each other with a greeting of the age of Jahiliyyah. The Prophet said, "Why do I see, O son of Amr, hatred in your people?" He said, "This is without my being the cause of their hatred. But I found them associating divinations with Allah, and I was reluctant to do the same. I wanted the religion of Abraham." The Prophet said, "Would you like some of the food?" He said, "Yes." Then the Prophet put before him the meat of the lamb. Zayd bin Amr said, "What did you sacrifice to, O Muhammad?" He said, "To one of the idols." Zayd then said, "I am not one to eat anything slaughtered for a divinity other than Allah." So here we clearly read that in the time of Jahiliyyah, the Prophet Muhammad slaughtered a lamb to the idols. It was he who slaughtered the lamb to the idols, not someone else. Remember, in his pre-Islamic days, Muhammad was surrounded by idols. This is why years later he returned to cleanse the idols out of the Kaaba area. When he was chosen as a young man to place the black rock into the corner of the Kaaba, he doesn't object to the presence of the other idols. There were 359 other idols in that place. So it's obvious that before she converted to Islam, Khadijah was also a pagan. That is what all of the early Islamic writers tell us. Anyone who claims otherwise simply doesn't know their Islamic history very well. These things are not hidden, they're plainly recorded by the earliest recorders of Islamic history. We will end here and we will make a second video on the life of Khadijah, and we will examine the location in Saudi Arabia that is often called Khadijah's house. That'll be in the next video. I'm Dan Gibson, and this has been another video in the series Archaeology and Islam.